We're going to keep this presentation to 1 hour. So welcome everybody. This is a pretty large turnout. It looks like we're up to about 112 participants so far. So let's get started. We're going to try our best to get to as many questions or comments as we can during this presentation, but we do have to keep timing in mind. So if people have really burning questions that they don't feel like were answered during this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me or Abbott. We will have some of our contact information, I think, at some point during this presentation. And I think we can get started. So Abbott, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Okay, I'm Abbott Filson, and I'm the board chair of SUFU, which stands for Speaking Up for Us.
Great, and my name is Lauren Lilly. I'm an attorney here with Disability Rights Maine, and today we are going to be talking about the home and community-based services settings rule. We're going to be going over the basics of the rule and ways that advocacy can be effective. But I'm going to let you do what you did the last time around, which is just reading the slides to start out.
Okay.
Great.
Here's the workshop agenda. We're going to go over what are home and community-based services and what is the settings rule. What does the home and community-based services settings rule mean for people receiving the services, and how can we all make sure Maine follows the settings rule to improve HCBS for people?
Yep. So we're hoping that if nothing else, you come away with answers to these 3 bullet points.
All right. What are home and community-based services, also called HCBS? They are services provided in a person's home and community instead of in an institution. Federal government gives money to Maine to provide the home and community-based services. Maine needs to follow the HCBS rules so that it can continue to get money to provide those services.
So just a little bit of background on home and community-based services. So just like Abbott said, so they're services that it might be evident from the title that they're services that are provided in people's homes and in their communities rather than institutions. And just really briefly, so this is sort of based on a lot of history of people with disabilities residing in institutions, and in part from what a Supreme Court decision called Olmstead that basically said people that don't need to be in institutions shouldn't be in institutions. And so over time, we shifted away from institutionalizing people with disabilities to providing them with services in their homes and communities. The idea obviously being that we want people to be part of their communities and engaged in their communities. In Maine, as well as maybe in other states, so some of you may understand home and community-based services under what they're called in Maine, which is waiver services. So if anyone's ever heard the term waiver services or Section 18 or Section 19 or Section 20 or Section 21 or Section 29, those are all waiver services, which are the same thing as home and community-based services. So when we talk about HCBS, we're talking about all of those waiver services. And also just like Abbott said, so Maine gives money for these services, but also the United States, the federal government also gives money to provide these services. And so they set rules by which these services have to follow.
The HCBS settings rule is meant to improve services by making sure the services help people fully integrate into their communities. They provide rights protections, and they make sure services are individualized and person-centered. Maine has until March 2023 to make sure all service providers are following the settings rule?
Yeah, so the settings rule is a rule, I guess it's maybe a series of rules really, that was created by the federal government in 2014 is when it first passed. And so it creates protections for people who receive home and community-based services. And the idea being that, you know, people have moved out of institutions, they're receiving services in their homes and in their communities. And we want to make sure that they're not still somehow isolated from those, that they're able to still sort of fully integrate into communities and be part of their larger communities. And so we're going to get into soon a little bit more about what the rules requires, but that's sort of what the rule is intended to do, to make sure that people aren't isolated. And so the rule, like I said, passed in 2014, and it gives states until March, I think it's March 17th of 2023. It had a couple of extensions over the years. And so by that deadline of March 17th, 2023, all places where home and community-based services are given to people have to follow this rule if they want to continue to receive money.
This is a big deal for people receiving services. The settings rule will affect all areas of life: home support, community support, employment, and person-centered planning, etc. Self-advocates and other stakeholders can help to make sure Maine follows the settings rule and improves services. We'll get into more on that later.
Yeah, so that's our third bullet point, kind of how people can be involved. I guess at this point, I'll ask Abby if there's been any questions that maybe we want to reply to at this point.
Yeah, sure. So we had one question wondering about what the Olmsted Act was. So maybe you could go back a little bit and provide some more context on that.
Yeah, sure. So what Olmsted is, so let me back up even further and not go too long down this road. But so in 1990, the United States passed a law that probably I would hope all of you have heard of, called the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And that law prohibits, it says you are not allowed to discriminate against people based on their disability. It says a lot of things, but that's basically the most important thing that it says. And so that was in 1990. In 1999, a lawsuit was filed and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the lawsuit is known as Olmsted. And basically what the Supreme Court said was that if people that have disabilities are institutionalized unnecessarily, so they don't need to necessarily live in institutions, that is discrimination. And so it violates the ADA if you are stuck in an institution and you don't need to be. And so that's kind of what created this prioritization, created this push toward home and community-based services rather than institutions. Any other questions right now, Abby, that we should take before we move on?
I think that's it.
Okay.
What does the HCBS settings rule mean to people who receive services?
We're going to get into some of the more specific parts of some of the things that the rule requires.
The HCBS settings rule means opportunity. The places where the home and community-based services are provided must give people as much access to the community as people who don't receive services. The opportunity to engage in community life, including setting your own schedules, deciding where you receive services, and who to spend time with. Opportunity to seek employment in integrated workplaces.
So this is some of the things that the rule requires. And so the rule is really specific. So the rule, the settings rule really speaks to where are people receiving services And those places, we're going to call them settings, they have to follow the rule. So some of the things that the rule requires, and again, this is really to make sure that those settings are allowing people to be fully part of their community. So I'm going to talk for a second about that third bullet point, that employment bullet point. So one of the things that the rule really emphasizes is opportunity to seek employment, and not just any employment, what we call competitive integrated employment. That means employment that is in settings that don't just employ other people with disabilities, competitive, meaning that they're people that are working who receive services are getting the same sorts of wages that other people receive. Maine is already, and has been for some time now, what's called an employment first state. And that means that our policies have to emphasize employment. And so people's, person-centered plans and people who receive services, the idea is it's really supposed to be aimed at helping people prepare for employment, helping people seek employment, helping people maintain employment. So that's a really big thing that Maine's already been focused on. And so this HCBS settings rule also is focused on that. And so it's sort of piggybacking in some ways on Maine's already standing philosophy on employment. Some of the other things the rule requires here, again, we're talking about opportunity to engage in community. So it's, you have to be able to set your own schedule. You have to be able to decide where you're going to receive your services. And you get to decide sort of who you want to spend your time with. The basic idea being that people who receive home and community-based services get to have the same access to the community as people who are not receiving those services. Are there any questions right now, Abby?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, one question just came in. I'm so sorry. So someone asked how this might affect the current model of community support.
Abbott, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, community supports is part of the rule. So community supports as well as home supports have to follow the rule.
Yeah, that's right. Community supports have to follow the rule. And the point being that people need to be able to have choice, informed choice. So again, it's about providing as much access to the community as people who don't receive services. So that applies to people receiving services in their home. That applies to people receiving services, work supports, community supports. So it applies to all.
Awesome. And then we had one other, or a couple more questions that are coming in. So someone was curious on why this is such a big deal. Is it because service providers don't do this now?
That's a good question. I'm gonna let Abbott take that one.
Well, it's a big deal because I guess from all those surveys, there were some people with disabilities that felt that they don't have much control over their life, and they were being told stuff that was more in a institutional setting rather than living on your own.
Yeah. And I'll also point out, when the government was sort of crafting this rule, it got sort of finalized and put into place in 2014, but it was a work in progress for a lot of years, and a lot of stakeholders had input into this rule. So the government sought input from people with disabilities who receive services, from family members, from service providers. So this rule that we're talking about is really sort of a response to a lot of ideas from a lot of different perspectives.
Awesome. And then, as I said, we have a few more questions. So someone was curious on how the lack of accessible housing negatively impacts the settings rule.
Well, I think that that's a complicated question that is, I think, I think Maine is maybe coming, these are things that we're gonna have to figure out, right? Maine has until March 2023 to sort of make sure that people have informed choice. And maybe the next slide, we can get a little bit further into that, because we're gonna talk a little bit more about sort of non-disability specific settings and what that means. So I'm maybe gonna punt going too far into that question until the next slide or two. And please ask it again if we don't answer it thoroughly.
And then how does this impact the current model of day programs?
I think that's another complicated question. And so, and I'm going to talk a little bit, or Abbott and I will talk a little bit further into the presentation about sort of Maine's statewide transition plan. So Maine not only has to comply with this rule by 2023, but it has, and it has to submit a plan to the federal government on how it's going to comply. So far Maine has submitted what's called an initial statewide transition plan, and it's gotten initial approval, but in the next year or so, it's going to need to submit something a lot more detailed. So I think some of that remains to be seen, but I think, the bottom line is the rule requires that people have the same access to community as people who don't receive services. So I think, again, it comes back to choice and making sure that people, that second bullet point saying deciding where you receive services. So it really comes down to people being able to have choice on where they're getting services. All right, I'm going to move on in the interest of time.
The home and community-based service settings rule means choice. The person gets to choose where and how they receive services from different options. They can choose to get services in a non-disability specific setting. They can choose to have their own room for residential services.
Yep, so this is a little bit, I think, obviously focusing a little bit more on choice. People get to choose where they're receiving home and community-based services. And when we talk about the choice to receive services in a non-disability specific setting, so the rule sort of defines that, and it's exactly, I think, what it sounds like. So a non-disability specific setting is a setting that isn't just for serving people with disabilities. So, just going back to that question about day programs or community support programs, that I'm assuming that the person asking the question was talking about sort of facility-based or centers that serve people. And I don't know that those are necessarily not allowed under this rule. But again, going back to choice, so people get to choose where they're receiving services. So, someone might make that choice, and conversely, someone might want to make the choice to receive community supports away from a disability specific setting. And so the rule requires that they be able to make that choice. Any questions, Abby?
Yes, someone had asked, will funding be available for more one-to-one options?
I hope so. I know that these are all things that the department is working on. So, I think part of this training is to kind of make people aware of what the rule requires and how are we going to get there. I think, at least for some of these details, is still very much a work in progress. Like I said, the state is working, has already submitted an initial plan, but I think it needs to figure out a lot of these details moving forward on how we're going to guarantee choice for people. Did I leave anything out there, Abbott?
I don't think so.
And then one more question, Lauren. Someone had asked, who determines the need and level for services for those with disabilities?
Abbott, do you have an answer for that one?
It's the client themselves.
Yeah, I agree. I think the client, and often clients work with their planning teams. So, they may have a guardian or they may have family members. Oftentimes they'll have what's called a case manager or a care coordinator, service provider. So, often it's not a client making all of these decisions totally unsupported. They have a team to help them sort of figure out what their service is, what are their options.
Awesome, great.
Okay, should we move on, Abby? We good? All right, Abbott.
Yep.
Did I move? Yes, okay.
The HCBS settings rule means rights, respecting people's rights to privacy, dignity and respect, and freedom for coercion and restraint. It respects people's life choices, and you get to control your own personal resources.
Yep. So again, we're kind of coming back to the idea of sort of being fully integrated in the community, being able to have, you know, sort of basic rights that, again, this rule doesn't really necessarily create new rights. I view this as sort of emphasizing rights that people have inherently, right? We have lots of rights just because we're people, because we're citizens of the United States under the Bill of Rights. And so this rule really emphasizes rights that, in my view, kind of already exist for people. They have a right to dignity and respect. They have a right to choices in their life. And again, I think it sort of focuses on how services are supposed to be individualized. They're really supposed to be sort of person-centered. Any burning questions after this slide, Abby?
I think someone had asked a little earlier and I had missed it and didn't answer it all the way, but someone had asked, will the settings rule override the conflict-free rule? And will clients be able to be allowed to choose where they get all of their services?
I don't know. My guess is no. My guess is that there are still the rules, and I don't specifically know what the question asker is asking when they say the conflict-free rule. I'm assuming that they're talking about conflict-free case management, which is that you can't have a case manager that's also a direct service provider in general, because it creates a conflict of interest. So my guess is that all the rules prohibiting conflict of interest, HCBS is not going to override that.
Awesome, thanks. And then someone had asked, how does shared living fit into choice?
Abbott, what do you think about
that? That might be one of the options the client chooses.
Yep.
Great, and I think that's all the questions for now.
It gives extra protections for people who live in a place that is owned or controlled by their provider. Lease or other type of agreement that protects your rights as a tenant. Private bedroom if you want. The right to lock your bedroom door. Choice of roommate. Freedom to decorate your home as you like. Control of your own schedule, access to food at any time, having visitors at any time, and physically accessible home.
So in some circumstances, the HCBS settings rule understands that people who live in a place that's controlled by the provider who's providing the services, they really want to make sure that people who live in those kinds of settings really have the same kind of choice than if they were living independently. When we talk about provider owned or controlled settings, we're generally talking about group homes. We're generally talking about shared living and what's called family-centered homes, which there's not a ton of those left in the state, but there's a good number of them. So these are all homes that not only is the provider providing services, but they're also sort of acting like a they're kind of in the role as a landlord. Basically, you're living in a home that's either owned by the provider or rented by the provider. And so they want to make sure that there's these extra protections in place. Are there any questions about this slide?
Yes. So first, can you talk a little bit about how this would impact the current system of small group homes?
I don't necessarily think it would impact. I mean, it's like many things, I think that the settings rule in general is going to impact the way people provide services. But I mean, group homes are not prohibited under this rule. It just, it does mean that some group homes might have to change their practices in order to comply with the rule.
Awesome, great. And then one other, or a couple more questions. So will the HCBS settings rule provide for more access to personal advocacy supports or access to advocacy supports from outside agencies?
I'm just trying, I'm pausing because I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question. So the HCBS rule, it doesn't necessarily speak specifically to advocacy, so I'm not sure that it is creating a new right of advocacy. I mean, of course, Disability Rights Maine does and will continue to provide advocacy services for people with disabilities, whether they receive service, you know, home and community-based services or not. But I don't know that the rule specifically broadens or narrows the right to advocacy in that respect.
Yeah, and if the person that asked that question has more clarification, definitely send it in. And then someone had asked, what about people that have issues with food? Would a doctor's order be accepted as limiting food, or would they have to have a plan as well as a doctor's order?
But do you know the answer to that question?
I would say yes. It would have to be documented in their safety plan. And also if maybe a doctor's order would have to back that up, but that's all I think.
Yeah, the settings rule does allow for some modifications of some of these requirements, specifically on this slide. And food is definitely one of them. I think visitors is another. Controllable. There's a number of bullet points on this that are allowed to be modified under the settings rule. And there are requirements that you need to follow in order to modify them. And I'm definitely not going to be able to name them all off the top of my head, but in general, it's things like documenting it thoroughly in the person's person-centered plan, sort of explaining why positive supports and why this person needs this modification of their rights, talking about how whatever the modification is going to minimize its impact on other people that might be living in the home, talking about ways that you're going to be able to fade the restriction or the modification. I'm definitely leaving some out, but those are, it needs to be documented, and you basically need to show why such a modification is necessary.
Awesome, thanks. And then I had missed a question from earlier, and I think there was some confusion about whether the rule had to be in place by March of 2022 and not March of 2023. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, it was 2022 for a while, for a number of years, and the government recently extended it to 2023, sometime in the last handful of months.
Awesome, and that's all the questions I have right now.
Okay, moving on. Abbott, do you want to take this slide?
Sure. Institutions can never receive money intended for HCBS. Nursing facilities, ICFs, hospitals, or any other place that has the qualities of an institution. Some types of places are so isolating because of how they are designed and are more like institutions than homes.
Yeah, so this just, I think is really just emphasizing that we're talking about home and community-based services. And they're never supposed to be by definition, they're not institutions. So those first 3 bullet points are just sort of hard nose, right? If it's a nursing facility, it's not home and community-based services. If it's what's called an intermediate care facility, just flat out, it's not HCBS. If it's a hospital, it's not HCBS. And then that last bullet point is kind of like a catch-all. It's the idea that some places are really just so isolating. They have what's called the qualities of an institution. And I'm not going to go too far down this path, but for places that are not nursing facilities, ICFs, or hospitals, but have been found to have the qualities of an institution, there is a pathway out of that. So there is a way for them to work with the department to try to fix those issues. And the federal government will decide if those have been properly fixed in order to qualify for HCBS. And there's a whole sort of process for that. It's called heightened scrutiny. I'm not going to go too far down that hole right now, or really at all, because we have some activities coming up and I really want to get to them.
And I don't see any questions
Okay,
right now on that.
All right. All right. I bet you want to take this question.
Yep. What kinds of issues do you or people you know have with the services you receive?
So I think we're just trying to maybe get a pulse from people who are attending this, kind of what are some of the big issues that they see with services right now that might need to be changed.
So someone had mentioned wait lists.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody else, you can post it in the chat or the Q&A, and I will try to read it out loud.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on because we've got some scenarios we want to move on to. I bet you want to take this.
Sure. Activity with scenarios. We will review each scenario and discuss.
So we've got 2 scenarios. We're going to try to spend maybe 5 minutes on each one so that we can keep this presentation to an hour. So let's go to the first one. Abbott will read that one.
Okay. Scenario 1. Ferdinand lives in a group home with 2 housemates. The staff at the home prepare meals for the residents. Dinner time is scheduled for 5 p.m. The menu for tonight's dinner is spaghetti. Ferdinand is not hungry at 5 p.m. He would rather have a sandwich later. Staff tell him it's spaghetti at 5, or he'll have to wait until breakfast to eat, which is the next scheduled meal. Problems.
So again, if anybody wants to point out some issues, feel free to send it in the chat or the Q&A, and I can try to read it out loud for you. And we'll give people a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, so someone typed in, it's a rights violation. Someone else said no choice, food restriction, and rights violation.
Yeah, all of those things. I see more things blinking, so I'm gonna give Abby a minute.
Thank you. Yep, somebody else said he should be able to have what he wants at all of the time. Someone else said he has the right to not eat spaghetti and have his sandwich. And someone else said that is just not nice! Exclamation point! Exclamation point! I agree with that.
I like that one. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's right.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and someone else said it sounds like the quality of an institution.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's one of the things that the settings rule is really trying to make sure that we're turning away from those qualities of an institution. And one of the qualities of an institution is a really regimented schedule, a really regimented menu. And so I think that's why the settings rule is really emphasizing this kind of choice. So I think everyone nailed it in terms of, you know, having choice, having access to food at any times, which is a rule requirement. And the other thing that jumps out for me is the right to set your own schedule, right? And that includes your meal times.
Perfect. Yeah, I
Anything
think
else before I move on?
everybody else has said similar things.
Great.
Yep, and someone said that's a call to DRM, which I would agree. Awesome. So I think we're okay to move on to the next.
Okay. All right, Evan. There you go.
Scenario number 2, Parker's meeting with her planning team at our personal-centered planning meeting. Parker is interested in getting a job. Parker's mother knows Parker gets nervous in new situations and doesn't think looking into employment is a good idea. Parker's case manager will not include employment as a goal on her PCP, even though Parker said it was her goal. Problems.
So this question is really aimed at the person-centered planning process. And one thing we didn't really talk about, that's a whole big part of the home and community-based rule. We're mostly talking about the settings part of the rule. So that's setting requirements where people receive services. There's also a whole portion of the rule that talks about person-centered planning. And I think in some ways it reflects kind of the ideas that Maine already has about person-centered planning. Mainly, I think that it's supposed to be person-centered. Abbott, what do you think about this scenario?
I think there is a problem because even though Parker gets nervous in new situations, it is one of his goals. It should be in his PCP, even though they might not work on it. It should still be documented that it's a goal.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's person-centered. So if Parker wants it in their PCP, it should be in their PCP. And maybe the first step on working toward that goal is becoming more comfortable with new situations, right?
Yep.
And I think we have gotten a lot of comments that say exactly that, that Parker should be given the opportunity to explore job training. Parker should be able to make their own decisions, and that a case manager should never advocate against a goal that a consumer has.
All great points. Abbott, do you have any final thoughts on this scenario before we move on?
Nope, everyone hit it on the nose.
Right. Here you go, Abbott.
Okay. How can I make sure my services follow the home and community-based services settings rule?
So now we've kind of talked a little bit about what our home and community-based service is. We've talked a little bit about what is the settings rule and what does the rule require. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about the process of following the rule. Like we said, Maine's got until March of 2023, and it's been working on following this rule, and it's going to keep doing that because it's still got a ways to go. And so there are lots of ways that we can all, as stakeholders, be part of this process. And so we're going to go through some of these options right now.
Stay informed. You can go to the DHS or ODE's website for the home and community-based services, or you can email them directly.
Yep, so the Office of Aging and Disability Services is working on this as an initiative. I mean, they have to because it's a rule that they need to follow. And so they created this whole website that's just completely dedicated to home and community-based services and the settings rule. They created this email. And so I think step one in being active in any sort of initiative is just knowing about it and staying informed and knowing when there are opportunities to engage in the process. So this is really something I think that is important to stay informed. Any big questions popping up there, Abby?
Someone had asked, does the LTCOP have a role in enforcing this?
Have a role in enforcing it? Possibly. I think that that's for people that might not know, that's the long-term care ombudsman program. I think we all have a role in enforcing it, or at least monitoring it. You know, I think anybody that's at all related to either receiving home and community-based services themselves, or knows someone who is, or works with people who do, I think we all have sort of a role in sort of making sure that Maine follows this rule. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some specific ways that people can do that. And I don't know if I talk about it on a future slide, but I also want to point out that Maine also has created what's called a stakeholder advisory group, specifically for home and community-based services. And Abbott and I are part of that group. Abbott, do you want to talk for a second about what that is?
Yes, it's a group of professionals and self-advocates to help the state come up with ways to get this rule into place.
Yep. We've been having regular meetings, right?
Yep. We have one coming up next month, believe it or not.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move on, and we can go back to some of the questions that might be coming in. Maybe they'll be answered.
Tell DHHS what you think of its plan to follow the home and community-based settings rule. DHHS wants your input on how it can improve services and follow the settings rule. The home and community-based settings rule requires that DHHS gets your input. Input can be given through public comment and various stakeholder groups, and also informally.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about what's called the statewide transition plan. And so that's something that is required. So Maine and all states have to submit a plan, a written plan to the federal government that says how we're going to follow this rule. And a lot of, so Maine submitted, it submitted some earlier versions of the plans in past years, but most recently it submitted its initial statewide transition plan. I think it was June of this year. And it was required to be put out for public comment. So Maine released the plan to the public on its website. And the public had 30 days, I think it was, to sort of provide comments. And I think it only got about 10 comments. So just, there'll be another opportunity for this, but I would encourage anybody next time this comes around to really review the plan and comment on it, because I think we could do better than 10. But a lot of the initial plan is Maine is currently sort of still taking stock of its settings. It's assessing, what's happening right now with these settings? What kind of services are we delivering to people right now? That's it needs to figure that out in order to figure out what, if anything, needs to change about those services. So that's a lot of the work that's being done, I think, right now.
And someone had asked real quick, who does someone make the phone call to complain if they feel the rule has been misapplied? That's coming up on a slide soon. So I'm gonna hold off on the answer to that question until a couple slides from now. And then one quick question about the stakeholder advisory group and whether that includes parents and families of people with disabilities.
It does include some parents who are providers.
Awesome. All right. And then we have a few more questions, but I might hold off on those until a couple of slides later. So
okay, great. All right, Abbott, I'm going to move to the next slide then. We're doing perfect on time.
Opportunities to give your opinion on the home and community-based services settings rule. Maine will put out a final version of its statewide transition plan for public comment. Notice will be posted on its HCBS website. If Maine finds settings that isolate, It'll ask for people to comment how it will fix them. DHHS has a stakeholder advisory group for input. Sometimes they are looking for new members, particularly people who receive services.
Yep, so going back to that first point, so we talked about the statewide transition plan. It's been a while since I looked at Maine's timeline. I think sometime next year, they'll be putting out their what will be their final version of the statewide transition plan. So again, I gave that website earlier, a couple slides back, about staying informed. So that's where it will be posted when they put out their next version. Again, I think that's in sometime in 2021. And so stay informed. They're going to let you know when it comes out, and you're going to have a month to comment on it, and raise concerns if you have any through that process. I will send out, by the way, or I'll have Abby send out a copy of this PowerPoint, because I know that we're putting some links up that people are not able to click on. And so we can send that out to people so they have all of this information.
Absolutely.
That second bullet point, I talked a little bit about how home and community-based services can't be provided at institutions. And I talked a little bit about how some places are just so isolating. They're like almost just, they're basically an institution, and they'll be subject to what's called heightened scrutiny. So they have to like even more prove that they're allowing people to be fully integrated into the community. So if Maine, in this process that it's evaluating all these settings, finds settings that isolate, and those settings aren't able to fix themselves within, I think it's June or July of next year, if Maine chooses to go forward with trying to get them to fix themselves, that is a whole other process that gets to be put out for public comment. They get to sort of say, here's some of the settings that we found that isolate, here's how we plan on fixing them, and then people will get an opportunity to provide feedback on that. So that will be something to look out for. Again, I think that would be on the department's website.
And then Lauren, we've gotten a couple questions about how how COVID is impacting settings that are potentially isolating right now. And so can you talk a little bit about, I know that's a hard question, but.
It's a hard question. I mean, it absolutely is. I think Abbott would agree with me that COVID restrictions are definitely impacting settings. And I think that that's something that I'm going to guess not just Maine, but every state is sort of grappling with, because, you know, the rule is the rule, and it requires full community access. And I realize that there are some states, including our own, that have, you know, rules in place to sort of combat COVID that are generally applied to the public. And so I think, you know, I don't have an easy answer for that, but it's definitely something I think that Maine and every other state's going to need to grapple with in terms of coming into compliance with this rule.
Awesome. And I think that's all the questions right now. I know there's a couple more, but we'll get to a little later.
Okay, great. All right, Abbott, here's the next one.
Even more opportunities to give your opinion on the home and community-based settings rule. DHHS and DRM are conducting on-site validations, going to places that provide HCBS, like homes and day programs, and speaking to clients and staff. Case managers are completing surveys with all clients receiving HCBS to get their opinions on their services. Participate and speak up.
Yeah, so like I've already said, Maine right now, the big push right now is sort of figuring out what our service is, how do they need to change, and so they're doing that in two really major ways. One is going to the settings and laying eyes on them and speaking to people who receive the services, speaking to staff, filling out surveys with them, kind of reviewing policies and procedures of agencies, sort of just seeing how they're set up with their own eyes, and then giving all this information back to the department to sort of assess. And then for the places that are not getting on-site validations, case managers have these surveys. They're called individual experience assessments, I believe, IEAs, and case managers should be doing them with all of their clients. And it's a survey basically asking questions about what kind of services they receive. And again, that information is going back to the department to figure out sort of the status of services. And so I would encourage anybody that receives services that's viewing this, if their case manager wants to do the survey with them, speak up. That's an opportunity to tell someone about your services. If someone from the department or someone from Disability Rights Maine comes to a setting where you're receiving services and they ask to interview, and encourage you to participate so that your voice can be heard. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next one.
Contact someone if you think the services you are receiving do not follow the home and community-based settings rule.
And I'm going to go right to the next one because I'm sure that everyone will be saying, who? Who do I contact?
Who do I contact if I think my services don't follow the home and community-based services settings rule? You can contact DHHS. You can email the HCBS website directly. You can contact SUFU. You can contact Disability Rights Maine, or you can contact your case manager.
Yep, so these, this might not be everyone in the universe of people you can contact. These were just people, these were just sort of what we came up with. And again, remember that this is still a process that's happening. So I am certain that not all settings are following the rule at this point in time, because we're still working on that. That's what this process is. So just understand that, but it is great to get your voice known. It is great to be heard. Your case manager, if you have one, or your care coordinator, if you have one, if they haven't done the survey with you yet, they hopefully will at some point in the coming months. Settings where you receive services might get an on-site validation. If you've got questions, you can contact the department. You can contact Speaking Up for Us. You can contact us at Disability Rights Maine to share concerns.
Spread the word about HCBS. Tell your friends, family, and anyone else who will listen about HCBS and encourage them to engage in the process.
And but do you want to take that next one?
Resources. The Council on Quality and Leadership HCBS 6 video series for great plain language information. Or you can go to the other website for which is Information for Advocates.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out a way to best describe how to find this YouTube video. So this was the most efficient way I could figure out, is just to go to YouTube and search for the CQL HCBS overview. And it's just a really great sort of animated series about a lot of what we talked about today, and probably even more detail because it's 6 separate videos. And perfect timing.
Questions?
Awesome. So there was one question, I want to be sensitive to the time, of course, but there was one question about whether there has been a conversation about the challenges of living in a more rural area where there's a lack of opportunities to be involved in the community, and how, and not being able to go to places within a driving distance to like shop or places of interest. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. There's been some guidance from the government about rural communities, and Maine has plenty of them. And so, you know, the general rule of thumb, so like I've said many times, I think in the last hour, people that receive home and community-based services, the rule requires that they have access to the community to the same extent of people not receiving services. So when we're talking about rural areas, just because someone lives in a rural area where they might have to travel pretty far to go shopping or go to a movie when movies were still happening, or, you know, do something in the community, that doesn't necessarily mean that the setting is isolating. What you have to do basically is sort of compare their setting with the surrounding area to make sure that they're getting the same access to the community as the other people who are living in rural areas that are not receiving services. And so that's sort of a rule of thumb that the government's put out, because, you know, you can't consider just by virtue of the fact that you live in a rural area as itself isolating.
And then we just have some specific questions, and I would encourage, if you have a specific question, to contact DRM. We don't need to like get into all of the specifics here on this webinar, but yeah, contact DRM if you have a specific question. And I think that is everything that I have right now. So yeah.
Great, I think it was almost exactly an hour. Well, thank you everyone who attended this. The turnout was a lot higher than I even expected. So I hope that it was worthwhile for everyone that attended, and there were some really great questions. And like I said, we'll be sending out this PowerPoint to everyone that registered. And Abbott, do you have anything to add?
I don't.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.